Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Indecent Exposure, a true story of Hollywood and Wall Street, by David Mcclintick, foreword by James B. Stewart, narrated by Charles Constant. It's the jungle. It appeals to my nature. It's more than a place where streets are named after Sam Goldwyn and buildings after Bing Crosby. There's more to it than pink Cadillacs with leopard skin seat covers. It's the jungle, and it harbors an industry that's one of the biggest in the country. A closed-in, tight, frantically inbred and frantically competitive jungle. And the rulers of the jungle are predatory and fascinating and tough. L.B. Mayer is one of the rulers of the jungle. I like L.B. He's one of the rulers now, but he has to watch his step or he'll be done in. He's shrewd. He's big business. L.B. is tough. He's never trying to win the point you're talking about. His aim is always long range, to keep control of the studio. He loves Dory, but someday he'll destroy Dory. L.B. is 65, and he's pink and healthy and smiling. Dory is about 20 years younger, and he looks old and sick and worried, because L.B. guards the jungle like a lion. But the very top rulers of the jungle are here in New York. Nick Skank, the president of Lowe's Incorporated, the ruler of the rulers, stays here in New York and smiles, watching from afar, from behind the scenes. But he's the real power, watching the pack close in on one or another of the lesser rulers. Close in, ready to pounce. Nick Skank never gets his picture in the papers, and he doesn't go to parties, and he avoids going out in public. But he's the real king of the pack, and he does it all from New York. God, are they tough. John Huston, 1950. The new Hollywood is very much like the old Hollywood. David Chasman, Executive Vice President, MGM, 1981. Foreword. James B. Stewart. I was squeezed into the back seat of someone's car that weekend, on the way to a beach on the south shore of Long Island, when I finally got my hands on it. A thick manuscript whose pages had obviously been well worn and run through the copy machine many times. The still unpublished book had been the talk of the house that weekend, which was filled with guests from the West Coast, as everyone called it. A prominent movie critic, a producer, an entertainment lawyer, among others. I was only there because I'd gone to school with the lawyer. I was a struggling young reporter, still new to New York from the Midwest of all places. In other words, I was a nobody. I looked at the title page, Indecent Exposure. How, I wondered, had someone come into possession of this? Especially since, to judge from the previous night's conversation, it was filled with revelations that were supposed to be top secret. This wasn't a bound galley, the kind of thing publishers circulate to reviewers and the media in advance of publication. It was a typewritten manuscript. My question was met with silent glares from the other passengers, and I realized this was something I wasn't meant to know. I stopped asking questions and started reading. I thought I'd just skim it to see what the fuss was all about. But once I started, I found myself reading every word. I continued once we got to the beach. I kept reading all the way home, disappeared into my room, and emerged only when I was done. Now I understood why the copying machines in Hollywood had been working overtime. I'll never forget the sheer pleasure of reading that manuscript. It had a narrative drive that grabbed you on the first page and never let go. You didn't need to have any particular interest in the entertainment business to be enthralled by it. I didn't know David Mcclintick, the author, but I was in awe of his reporting and writing and a little envious. How had he gotten so many people to talk and to bare their souls? How had he penetrated the boardrooms and offices, the real centers of power in the entertainment industry? And how had he woven all that information into such a compelling narrative? But I also felt bad for him. I figured he was losing royalties because so many people like us were reading the bootlegged copies. It turned out I needn't have worried. The New York Times ran a story about how the manuscript had set off a frenzy in Hollywood, and all the buzz just fueled broader interest. The minute the book came out, I ran to the bookstore and bought several copies, as did many others who had already read it. It leaped right onto bestseller lists and stayed there. It's hard to overstate the impact Indecent Exposure had on nonfiction writers of my generation. We all admired it and talked about it. Writers like Joan Didion and V.S. Naipaul and magazines like The New Yorker had shown that nonfiction could have the power of great literature, but indecent exposure showed that these kinds of stories were lying dormant in the world of business, waiting to be discovered. We looked at the Wall Street Journal, where David was a reporter, with fresh admiration, and found much to inspire us, especially in the front-page feature stories that were David's specialty. I, for one, knew I wanted to follow in his footsteps. Eventually I did. David had left at that point, but Norman Pearlstein, the paper's managing editor who hired me, stressed that indecent exposure was the kind of riveting journalism that he wanted more of. With his encouragement, a new generation of journal reporters began reporting and writing stories with narrative sweep and impact. Some of them also turned into best-selling books. When Norm and the Journal hosted a publication party for my book, Den of Thieves, David showed up. I was honored and delighted to meet him. Today the legacy of indecent exposure lives on, not just at the Journal, but everywhere great reporting and writing are prized. Part 1. 1. Evelyn Crystal, a slim woman of 41 with short blonde hair, eased her brown Pinto from Van Nuys Boulevard into the rush-hour crawl of the Ventura Freeway and headed east. She squinted into the sun, which had just cleared the snow-covered San Gabriel Mountains on the far horizon, straight ahead. It was 8 a.m., Friday, February 25th, 1977, clear and bracing, one of the chilliest mornings of the brief subtropical Los Angeles winter. Evelyn's drive would take 35 minutes if she was lucky, 45 minutes if she was not. Like thousands of logs glutting a river, the traffic crept past Bullocks and I Magnan, Coldwater Canyon Avenue and Laurel Canyon Boulevard, 20 miles an hour, then 50, then 10. Evelyn negotiated a careful merge with the southeast-bound Hollywood Freeway. Universal Studios on the left. Coenga Pass through the scrubby hills, green from the winter rains. Hollywood Bowl on the right. Off the freeway at Vine. South on Vine down the hill, stop and go through central Hollywood. The Capitol Records Tower. TAV Celebrity Theater presents the Merv Griffin Show. Art City. Vine becomes Rossmore at Melrose. Along Rossmore, gently curving past the Wilshire Country Club and the grand old homes of Hancock Park, all the way to Wilshire Boulevard. A long light, then across Wilshire to the stone gates of Fremont Place, an elegant and very private residential enclave. Another wait while the guard located Evelyn's name on the list. Over the speed bump, around the corner to the right and into the driveway of the first house, 97 Fremont Place West, where Evelyn's employer, Cliff Robertson, the motion picture actor, was in temporary residence. Evelyn might have preferred a commute as short as those during Cliff's previous extended visits to Los Angeles. He had rented houses in Coldwater Canyon and Brentwood, which were much closer to her home in the working-class San Fernando Valley community of Van Nuys. But in 19 years as Cliff Robertson's part-time secretary, Evelyn Crystal had grown used to, and actually quite fond of, just about all of Cliff's eccentricities, mainly because they weren't really eccentricities at all, but quite normal traits that seemed eccentric only in Hollywood. One of them was a strong preference for living near where he was working. Most movie celebrities, no matter how remote the location of the studio that might be employing them at a particular time, insisted on living in Beverly Hills or Bel Air. Any other place would have threatened their self-image. Cliff Robertson, however, wasn't so insecure as most in Hollywood, another of his eccentricities. Although he sought out luxurious comfort wherever he went, it didn't necessarily have to have a shishi name like Beverly Hills. And since he was making a movie at Paramount that winter, the real estate agent had suggested to Evelyn Crystal that Cliff consider Fremont Place, which was only 5 minutes from the Paramount lot. Most of the 73 houses in the half-century-old enclave were as elegant as many in Beverly Hills, but only 3 celebrities lived in Fremont Place: Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight boxer, Karen Black, the film actress, and Lou Rawls, the pop singer. The majority of the residents were lawyers, bankers, and businessmen who drove east to offices in the skyscrapers of downtown Los Angeles instead of west and north to the show business factories of Beverly Hills, Hollywood, and Burbank. Fremont Placers tended mildly to disdain the entertainment industry, Its products occasionally were amusing, but its people and ambience were too gaudy and often too vulgar for the modest and somewhat smug sensibilities of Fremont Place. As it happened, this was an attitude which was privately shared by the new resident of number 97 West, still another of Cliff Robertson's atypical traits. But as people close to Cliff were aware, his choice of temporary abode and his attitude toward his industry were not isolated quirks. They were broad hints of the kind of person Cliff Robertson was, a maverick, usually a benign one, but by Hollywood standards nonetheless a maverick, whose determined independence manifested itself multifariously, from the way he handled his money to the way he handled his career to the way he handled his life. Although he had grown up in Southern California, Robertson had always found the Hollywood community somewhat claustrophobic and more than a bit tawdry, and had chosen to live in New York City for much of his adult life. He didn't depend on Hollywood for financial security, though he had earned a great deal of money there. He was independently wealthy in his own right, and was married to one of America's richest women, Dina Merrill, the actress, socialite, and daughter of the late Marjorie Merriweather Post and the late E.F. Hutton. Unlike many movie people who found it chic to spend their money freely but ignore its management, Robertson watched his money and investments carefully, and instead of using one of the big, flashy financial management agencies in Beverly Hills, which were status symbols themselves to many in the community, he chose to have his finances handled by a small, staid CPA firm on Sunset Boulevard in Old Hollywood. At deeper levels of personality and character, too, Cliff Robertson was something of an alien. In an industry populated by sizable numbers of loud, slick, bullying maneuvers, Robertson came across as the complete gentleman, kind, pleasant, deliberate, not especially temperamental, not unreasonably demanding toward people around him, a man who was never more content than when he was spending time with his family in the privacy of their home. The last of the hearth-huggers, Dina called him. Moreover, in a community where erratic and unethical human behavior were common enough to require constant vigilance, Robertson seemed to live by a traditional moral code, simple and staunch, forged in his strict Presbyterian upbringing. Robertson's way of life, of course, endeared him to his friends, associates, and employees, people like Evelyn Crystal, for example, who had lived for 2 decades on the fringes of the Hollywood scene, but centered her life on her family, their printing business in Van Nuys, and the Roman Catholic Church. But Cliff's qualities grated a little on a lot of Hollywood people. They found him self-righteous, old-fashioned, too bland to be much fun, and, worst of all, too unpredictable ever to be fully acceptable in the world's ultimate company town. In these people's eyes, Robertson was perpetually guilty of a serious and unforgivable offense. He didn't truly need Hollywood. As a result, a number of his relationships in the entertainment community had always been a bit uncomfortable and had contained the seeds of friction. Although Cliff had never been a big enough star to dictate terms of film contracts and isolate himself from the hurly-burly of the business, the friction had usually been quiescent and had always affected his career only occasionally and only in relatively minor ways. But all of that was about to change. Cliff Robertson soon would be engulfed in a holocaust of controversy and pain that would maim several lives, including his own, wound hundreds of other people, and jostle the foundations of the world's most glamorous industry. The institution of Hollywood, with all its staying power, would never be quite the same again. Evelyn Crystal passed through the white stucco Spanish-style house and onto the large patio where Cliff Robertson, clad in slacks and a heavy sweater, was relaxing next to the pool with a mug of coffee and a lap full of mail. Dina wasn't in evidence. 8-year-old Heather Robertson was brought to the patio by her governess to kiss her father goodbye before leaving for school, and Cliff and Evelyn got down to work. When the Robertson family was away from New York for extended periods, their mail was collected in large envelopes and forwarded to them every few days. When it arrived in Los Angeles, Cliff would summon Evelyn, dictate replies to letters, give her bills to pay, and turn over any other matters which she appropriately could handle. That morning in Fremont Place, it took about an hour and a half to dispense with the 24 or so pieces of mail that had just arrived. All but one was fairly routine. It was a windowed envelope from the Internal Revenue Service containing an IRS Form 1099 Statement of Miscellaneous Income, 1976. The form indicated that Cliff Robertson had been paid $10,000 the previous year by Columbia Pictures. "Does this ring any bells with you?" Cliff asked Evelyn. She examined the document. "No." "Columbia Pictures, $10,000, Cliff mused. "That's funny. I didn't do any work for them last year, and I certainly didn't get any money from them. At least I don't remember any. It's an odd figure, too, 10,000. That's not what I get for a picture. Maybe it was supposed to be a residual payment of some kind, but whatever it was, I'm quite sure I didn't receive it. Why don't you check with Michael or Bud and see if they know anything about it?" By noon, Evelyn was back in Van Nuys, and Cliff was at Paramount, where, since late December, he had been filming a television movie to be entitled Washington Behind Closed Doors, based on the John Ehrlichman novel about the Watergate White House and the CIA. Cliff played the director of Central Intelligence. 2. The inquiry into the matter of the $10,000 seemed no more urgent than the many other tasks that Evelyn Crystal was performing for Cliff Robertson, and it was not assigned a unique priority. The following week she telephoned Abraham Bud Kahaner, the senior partner of Prager and Fenton, Robertson's accountants. Kahaner had no record of the $10,000 payment from Columbia Pictures. Neither did Michael Black, Cliff's agent at the Los Angeles Office of International Creative Management. Evelyn then phoned the Columbia Accounting Department in Burbank. After being passed among several clerks, she finally was told that the payment appeared to be related to the 1976 motion picture Obsession, a psychological thriller in which Robertson played a businessman who meets the double of his widow, Genevieve Bujold. Obsession, which director-writer Brian De Palma derived in part from Hitchcock's Vertigo, had not been made under Columbia Pictures' aegis. The studio had purchased the finished movie from an independent film company and distributed it. Evelyn confirmed with Kahaner and Black that all of Robertson's fees from Obsession had been paid by the filmmaker. He was owed nothing and had received nothing from Columbia Pictures. Cliff told Evelyn to demand a written explanation, and on Tuesday, March 15th, she dispatched a letter to Columbia's accounting department asking the details of the $10,000 payment. Columbia Pictures' movie and television operations were situated at the Burbank Studios, a 105-acre tract at the north foot of Cahuenga Peak, one of the highest and steepest hills in the ridge separating the San Fernando Valley from the rest of Los Angeles to the south. The Burbank Studios, together with nearby NBC, Universal, and Disney, formed the northern point of a rough 50-square-mile diamond, within which were found just about all of the companies, facilities, and people comprising what the world at large thought of as Hollywood, or the show business capital of the world. The eastern point of the diamond, as one looked at a map, was formed by Paramount Pictures and the ABC studios southeast of Burbank across the hills in the eastern part of Hollywood proper. The western point was the cluster of Beverly Hills, Century City, and the 20th Century Fox studios southwest of Burbank, across the hills in the western sector of Los Angeles. The southern point of the diamond was the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer lot, housing MGM and United Artists, a 45-minute drive south of Burbank in Culver City, not far from the Los Angeles airport. Columbia Pictures shared the 38 sound stages and other facilities of the Burbank studios with Warner Brothers. The Columbia executive offices were housed in a striking 2-story redwood tinted glass and concrete building with a central atrium at the northeast corner of the Burbank lot. The accounting department was on the second floor at the back. When Evelyn Crystal's letter arrived, the accounts payable supervisor, Dick Codillo, pulled the files and found that a check payable to Cliff Robertson had been drawn on September 2, 1976, at the request of the president of the Columbia studio, David Begelman, the flamboyant former talent agent who had been running Columbia for nearly 4 years. Codillo informed Begelman's office of the Robertson inquiry and was told that the money had been paid to Robertson to cover his expenses for a personal appearance tour that he had made to promote Obsession. The inquiry took 2 weeks to make its way from Codillo to David Begelman's office and back. Codillo forwarded the information to Evelyn Crystal on Monday, March 28th. What he forwarded was not the full story, however. Dick Codillo, a stocky man in his early 30s with thinning dark hair, did not tell Crystal a curious fact which he found amusing. Cliff Robertson's inquiry was one of dozens of similar inquiries and complaints that had deluged the studio during those late winter and early spring weeks. The furor arose because Columbia, in tightening some of its accounting practices to conform to stricter rules of the International Revenue Service, had reported to the tax authority, via the requisite Form 1099, a substantially greater number of miscellaneous payments for 1976 than it had reported for past years. Such payments, to actors, directors, producers, and a host of other people, were a way of life in the entertainment business. In addition to paying the salaries and fees prescribed in contracts for specific services such as directing or acting in a film, the studios also shelled out countless other payments under countless other labels, mostly to retain the goodwill of the recipients. A studio would give an actor $10,000 to cover his expenses on a promotional tour, knowing that the expenses would be only a fraction of the $10,000, but not asking for any accounting of unused funds. A director would do some extra work on a picture, and instead of being paid an additional fee, he would be given a new $30,000 automobile. Whether these payments were in cash, cars, or other tender, their tax status, historically, was in doubt. Theoretically, the payments were taxable, but the IRS never declared them so specifically, and the studios rarely bothered to report them to the IRS. The aggregate result was the payment of millions of dollars of tax-free income that was widely taken for granted by those who received it. In the 70s, however, the IRS explicitly ruled such payments taxable, and also developed more sophisticated auditing methods to detect them. The studios therefore began reporting more of the payments to the IRS, with the result that income that had been tax-free suddenly became taxable. Many of the habitual recipients were incensed, and in the early months of 1977, the time for reporting 1976 income, angry letters poured into the Columbia Pictures accounting department. Of course, the recipients of 1099 forms couldn't officially berate the studio for obeying the law. So instead, many people simply claimed that they had not gotten the payments indicated by the forms. Dick Codillo would routinely locate the documentation for payments that were questioned and inform the recipients that they had in fact received the payments. Codillo, a man who rather enjoyed pricking wealthy show business personalities with odious little government forms, assumed that the Cliff Robertson inquiry was like the others, and that a single letter of rebuff would end the matter as it had in other cases. When Evelyn reported to Cliff that Columbia claimed the $10,000 had been paid to him for his expenses on the Obsession promotional tour, he was mystified. Yes, he had traveled to 3 or 4 cities to promote Obsession, but he certainly hadn't been given $10,000 to pay his expenses. His accountants had been reimbursed after billing the studio directly, and the amount had come to far less than $10,000. "What are you going to do?" Dina Merrill asked her husband one evening in the Fremont Place house, shortly before he completed Washington Behind Closed Doors. "Jesus, I'm not going to pay taxes on $10,000 I didn't receive," Cliff said. "I'll just have to keep pressing until I get to the bottom of this." The mystery began to perplex Cliff. He didn't think about it constantly or even frequently, but it had ceased being a minor oddity and had become an issue to be resolved. He told Evelyn to keep needling Columbia. The Robertsons returned to New York in April, and Cliff soon left for Ireland to write a screenplay. When Evelyn again telephoned the Columbia accounting department, Dick Codillo was away, but she left a message that she wanted a copy of whatever document the studio claimed to have dispatched to Robertson. She received nothing. In late April she called again, and again Codillo was out. She left the same message to no avail. On Thursday, May 26th, she wrote another letter requesting a copy of the front and back of the canceled check. Dick Codillo again called for the Robertson file and, for the first time, actually examined the check. It had been drawn on Columbia Pictures' general account at the main Hollywood office of the Bank of America, made payable to Cliff Robertson, 870 United Nations Plaza, New York City, and sent to the office of the studio president, David Begelman, presumably for forwarding to Robertson. The check bore the endorsement Cliff Robertson, a bold, sweeping signature written with a felt-tipped pen, and also had been initialed with a ballpoint pen. The check had been cashed on September 10, 1976, 8 days after it was dated, at some branch of the Wells Fargo Bank in Los Angeles. It had cleared the Bank of America on September 13th. The more Dick Codillo stared at the endorsement, the uneasier he became. Although he could not be sure, the endorsement looked very much like the handwriting of President David Begelman. Codillo did not have anything else signed by Robertson with which to compare it, but he was intimately familiar with Begelman's writing, and this signature resembled it to a startling degree. Choosing his words carefully, Codillo phoned Evelyn Crystal, apologized for the delay, and told her that a check payable to Robertson actually had been drawn and cashed. "The endorsement may not be Mr. Robertson's, though," he said. "It appears to have been endorsed by someone whose initials are right under the endorsement." He mailed her a copy of the check, and when she received it the next day, she immediately phoned Codillo and confirmed that the signature definitely was not that of Cliff, whose official signature was Clifford P. Robertson, and whose handwriting was smaller and more delicate than that of the person who signed the check. Evelyn did not recognize the initials. Furthermore, no one had the legal authority to sign Robertson's name on his behalf. Codillo and Crystal agreed that there must be a reasonable explanation for the confusion, and that they would investigate further and stay in touch. Codillo, however, had no intention of investigating further himself. He took the file to his immediate supervisor, the Columbia studio controller, Louis Phillips. Codillo and Phillips had been close friends for years, and Phillips was the only person in whom Codillo felt free to confide his suspicions. "I think I know who signed that check, Lou," Codillo said. "I think Begelman himself endorsed it." Lou Phillips, a precise, careful man both in speech and manner, perused the check and correspondence. Without responding to Codillo's fear, he said he would look into the matter and that Dick shouldn't concern himself with it any further. 3. James T. Johnson, the Columbia Studios vice president for administration, was fond of quipping that he and Frank Sinatra were Hoboken, New Jersey's principal contributions to American show business. Although Johnson savored his company title and the accompanying perquisites, it was his nature to twit his modest role in the entertainment world rather than inflate it. Unlike many Eastern Street kids who had gotten CPA licenses, come to Hollywood, and put on airs, Jim Johnson had never bothered to smooth all of his rough edges and become a nouveau snob. He owned a spacious four-bedroom house in Encino and drove a Cadillac provided by the studio, but at age 38, slender with dark hair, he retained almost intact the coarse, jocular, one-of-the-boys style of his working-class Hoboken adolescence. It wasn't immaturity, just boyishness and irreverence, and he could restrain it when necessary. But it gave him a versatility of temperament that normally served him well in his main function as the vice president for administration, which was to know everything happening at the Columbia studio and keep it running smoothly. He wasn't a meticulous administrator, but he was savvy, as sensitive to the proclivities of clerks and janitors as to those of production vice presidents. Very little escaped his attention. Therefore, he was surprised and annoyed on the morning of Friday, June 3rd, when Lou Phillips presented him with the Cliff Robertson problem. As Phillips's predecessor as studio controller and more recently as his boss, Johnson had handled the occasional snafus that inevitably arose in the dispatch and receipt of tens of millions of dollars in checks of all sizes. But he had never seen anything like the Robertson inquiry. "Fucking weird," Johnson muttered as Phillips watched him examine the file. "Somebody sure cashed the fucking thing. No doubt about that." Johnson and Phillips had never been close, and Phillips was obsessively discreet in his conduct of studio business. So he didn't tell Johnson of Dick Codillo's suspicion that David Begelman had forged the check. He merely indicated that Cliff Robertson's people seemed intent on getting to the bottom of the matter. Still, Johnson didn't have to be prompted to the possibility of embezzlement. He thought first of Begelman's longtime secretary, Constance Danielson, who had borrowed several $1,000s from Columbia a couple of years earlier to make a down payment on a house. Jim had qualms about the loan at the time, not because he didn't trust Connie, but because the company normally didn't make loans to secretaries. But Connie had been with David Begelman for more than a decade. Begelman had brought her west with him when he had moved from the New York office of his talent agency to the Los Angeles office, and he had brought her with him to Columbia when he was made president of the studio in 1973. Thus the loan had been approved as the exception to a rule. Could Connie later have mismanaged her finances and desperately needed money? Johnson doubted it, but it was conceivable. It was inconceivable, however, that Begelman himself had embezzled funds. Jim was very fond of David, who had always treated him well, and whom Jim credited with transforming a nearly moribund movie studio over the past 4 years into a lively, spirited place to work. With his huge salary and lavish expense account, David couldn't have needed $10,000.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?